Welcome back. Bruce McConnell with Locomotive Systems Training, and I think Happy New Year is in order for us here right now. Hope you had a great holiday and a great Happy New Year. And let's start out on the right track. We're almost done with part 1. And in the next several videos, we're going to start going into the actually air brakes. Not to be confused with brake rigging, which is part of it, but we're going to go up above. Okay? So that's coming real soon. All right, so again, we're still with FRA, Locomotive Inspection, Federal Railroad Administration, Part 1, continued, LSTV-020. 20 videos, and we're still going strong. All right, here we go. All right, we're still in the truck frame area. This little guy right here is known as a shock absorber. Let's talk about what it is. The purpose of the shock absorber is to absorb roadbed oscillation. The shock absorber dampens up and down movement of the journal box. Now, it's a rather robust shock absorber, and it has to be, and what it does, it dampens the up and down movement between the truck frame and the actual journal box, which is connected to the axle, which is part of the traction motor. So, a lot of suspension going on right here. Let's talk about the defects, and then we'll go back and we'll talk about them in a little bit. Number 1, loose and missing fasteners. Again, I know it sounds old school and repetitive and whatnot, but you know, if these bolts are loose or missing, that could have an adverse effect on how this piece of equipment works. Remember, Rule 229.45 general conditions states improper functioning of component. If that bolt's loose or missing, hence it should become a defect. Cracked or broken mounting brackets. Okay, you have two mounting brackets up, a mounting bracket up above here, and you have a mounting bracket bolted to the end cap of the journal box. Okay, again, these lot of hostile environment, if you will. A lot of bang clang, a lot of up and down forces here. You look for the wells, they can get cracked. Sometimes these brackets can actually break off or fall off. Okay. Rubber grommets, torn, split, worn, or missing. Note, shock absorber must be tight on the grommets. Now, people say, well, gee, Bruce, what about the grommet if it cracks? You know, the rubber will dry out and it'll crack. It's my understanding, and again, if you would like to discuss this further, give me a call or go to my website. When these dry out, sometimes the grommet will crack. In my almost 40 years of railroading, I've never seen that written up by the FRA. Not to say that they couldn't. It's their discretion for grommets. I think what we're all looking for here is to make sure that this shock absorber, this housing here that's welded to the top and bottom portion, is tight against that grommet. There's no movement. Many times I've seen where the grommet's actually gone or badly beaten out of place. If that, you can grab hold of that shock absorber and you can move it within the confines of that bracket or top or bottom, yeah, then it would definitely become a reportable. Clearly formed droplets of oil. Well, it's a shock absorber. There's shock absorber fluid inside this chamber here, okay? So as the shock goes up and the shock goes down, that oil is going through an orifice to limit or absorb these oscillations, okay? Hence the term shock absorber. Well, what will happen is, through normal wear, and then eventually when it gets older, what will happen is this clearance gets bigger and bigger, internal looseness will occur more and more, and what will happen is oil from the shock will begin to seep out around this outer upper edge. And what will happen is, it'll create like a kind of a fuzzy effect as oil and dirt. Remember, as this locomotive is going down the track, a lot of dirt's kicked up just from the roadbed, okay? So what will happen is the oil will be absorbed by this kind of dirt and dust, and it'll actually create a nice little round fuzzy ring, if you will, around this upper outer edge of this housing down here. Okay, that in of itself, according to the FRA, is not an FRA reportable. However, if I have clearly formed droplets of oil coming out of here, that then does become an FRA reportable, and that shock has to be replaced. Internal looseness, what I mean by that is the internal shell is rubbing on the external shell. You will actually see if this mechanism is shot inside here, and instead of the outer shell going parallel over the inner portion here, what will happen is it will actually create a rubbing effect. And it's usually on the outside, and it's real easy to see where the outer shell is rubbing on the inner shell. You can grab hold of that there in the middle and just move it back and forth. If it moves, guess what? That shock absorber is no good. So, a lot of things to talk about in the shock absorbers. Okay? Now, we're looking at underneath the running board. This is where, up right here is the upper deck of the running board. where engineering, or the operating crew and maintenance department crew walk above this here. So we're actually on the ground, there's our brake cylinder, and right up here overhead is the running board. And affixed to the bottom portion of this running board is some different types of air brake equipment, which we're going to go into in greater detail right after the first year. The purpose of the number 8 vent valve is to monitor brake pipe air at emergency rate equal to or greater than 900 feet per second. When brake pipe air flows at an emergency rate, each vent valve on every locomotive and freight car would rapidly dump brake pipe pressure to 0 psi. Note, it is a serial action. Each locomotive car propagates the emergency signal to the next locomotive or car. This is what we call the domino effect. And this car lights off, that car lights off, this car all the way down the line till we get to the end, or this locomotive lights off that locomotive and all the way to the end there. Or if the emergency occurs in the middle, it'll start in the middle of the train and go this way till we get to each end of that locomotive. We're going to dump all brake pipe, we're going to throw that locomotive and train into emergency. All right, there's our FRA rules. Defects: loose or missing fasteners. Again, air leaks or loose or missing wasp excluder. That's this little guy right here, and people say, what's a wasp? Well, everybody knows what a wasp is. That little guy that flies around and wants to sting you, and it hurts when they do. Well, what will happen is these little guys will actually get behind here, behind this rubber grommet, if you will, and they'll actually build nests in there, which will hamper the operation of that vent valve from working properly when it's needed to. So this is what they call a wasp excluder. It excludes them or prevents them from getting inside this number 8 vent valve and actually building a nest in there and making that valve, number 8 vent valve, ineffective or not working. So again, if the wasp excluder is, the rubber is split, cut, or downright missing, that becomes a federal defect. Okay? Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about is air horns. Air horns usually are mounted on top of the locomotive. Sometimes they're mounted on the hood. It just depends on where the locomotive, or the manufacturer, or where the railroad wants them mounted at. Okay, but they all have to be required to have air horns on them. Let's talk about it. The purpose of the air horns is to provide a loud, audible sound that alerts the general public that a train is nearing or is in a crossing. Okay, there's the FRA rules. Let's talk about the defects: loose or missing fasteners. You got to remember, this bracket here, a lot of times they're bolted, a lot of times they're welded. If the bolts are loose, that's a defect. If the welds are cracked, that's a defect. Okay, these are called trumpets. Okay, not surprising. There's three trumpet horns. There's 5 trumpet horns. This depends on the makeup of the locomotive and how it comes equipped. Some all face forward. Some have what they call 2 or 3 facing forward, 1 or 2 facing rearward. Remember, these locomotives can go both frontward and backwards. So, but again, the air horn, a lot of times, well, not a lot of times, but sometimes the air horn will actually crack in the trumpet area here. Okay. What if my air line here becomes restricted or plugged? I can't get near to the air horn. That becomes a defect. And believe you me, one thing, and unfortunately I've had the unfortunate experience in my career of being near when somebody in the cab is blasting on the air horn. It's really, really loud, and you of course you want to make sure you have your hearing protection in, and but you want to be aware of that. Whenever you're going to grab hold of that horn handle, you want to make sure that nobody is in the general area, so you don't wind up hurting somebody's hearing. And again, the FRA says this is a safety device. If it's on there, it must work. And there are specific FRA regulations that talk about the decibels of the horn, how many feet in front of the locomotive that sound must be able to be heard at, and so on and so forth. So very important safety item is the air horns. Okay? Let's go to the next one. Crossing bell. That too, ladies and gentlemen, is a safety device. When you're going through a crossing, the engineer will, on the newer locomotives, when you honk the horn, the bell automatically comes on when you're going through these crossings. Some, on the older equipment, you have to pull what they call a bell handle or a bell valve. Okay? The crossing bell. The purpose of the crossing bell is to send an audible signal that a locomotive or train is nearby. Okay? So let's talk about it. Defects: loose or missing fasteners. And again, there's 4 bolts and nuts that hold this on here. Cracked, broken, or missing bell. Missing bell, yeah, they've actually come in the shop missing. Okay, that got loose and poof, just fell off. Cracked or broken rubber grommets. You can't see it real well, but there's 4 big rubber grommets that insulate the bell from the mounting bracket. Because if you didn't do that, the bell, instead of having a nice clear ring or sound to it, it'd be thunk, 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 instead of a nice bing, bing, bing. Okay, so broken or missing rubber grommets would be a defect. Cracked or broken bell ringer. You can't see it here, but on the bottom of this inside is a great big bell ringer. And it's air operated by main reservoir, so as the main reservoir goes down, air pressure goes into the bell ringer, and there's a piston that actually moves the bell ringer up against the bell, and it actually rings the bell. Okay, so if the bell ringer is loose, or the set screw is loose, or the screw's missing, or the bell ringer is backed up, or the bell ringer is missing, all of those definitely they affect the operation of the bell, and that becomes a federal defect. Intermittent or non-operating bell motor, well, we talked about that. If you unscrew the bell ringer, inside there is a little, inside that center stem of the bell is what they call a bell motor. Okay, and that bell motor gets, again, the main reservoir, and all it does is the main reservoir goes down through it, and it pushes this little bitty piston that comes out and actually moves the bell ringer, and it makes it work. You always want to make sure that when you turn the bell on, ding, 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 even more than just a couple of dings, go about 15 dings. And again, make sure people aren't in the general area, because that bell can get real loud, okay? Give it about 10, 15 rings, because what will happen is if you have a marginal bell motor, it'll ring initially because the main reservoir pressure is high, but as that bell motor is consuming that air, what will happen is you have a bad or intermittent bell motor, it'll start to skip, 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 and then just stop. And if it skips or stops, that becomes a defect. You'll need to write that up and have the bell motor replaced. And by the way, on that bell motor, can we go back just a second? Don't just use the old trick of squirting some oil up there and, oh, it's good. You're not fooling anybody. Replace that bad bell motor. We want our quality high on the railroad industry. Okay, thank you. Traction motor air duct. Purpose of the traction motor air duct is to deliver air from the central air system to each traction motor for cooling purposes. Let's talk about them. There's our FRA rules. Defects, loose or missing fasteners. There it is again. Ripped or torn rubber bellows. That is just kind of a sandwichy looking affair. It's all one piece of rubber, okay? And the reason it's called the bellows is that, number one, it has to be able to move both up and down, okay? Weak or broken bellows spring. Well, inside this whole assembly is a great big coil spring. Not like a suspension coil, but it's you can push down on it and it'll actually move. But the coil spring, or the broken bellows spring, is designed to keep the air duct expanded and making contact with the bottom side of the locomotive frame. Okay, if you look up in here, and I've seen these springs that are worn or broken, where I'll have a 2 or 3 inch gap between where the contact surface is of the air duct to the bottom of the frame. That is definitely a defect, because you got to remember, like I said, with everything on that locomotive is engineered for a specific amount of oil pressure, fuel pressure, air pressure in this case here. Every cubic inch of air, or cubic foot of air, that is delivered to this central air system is required to go down and provide the proper cooling, whether I'm at idle, notch 4, or throttle 8. Okay? If I have a tear or rip in the bellows, or if the spring is weak and I got a big gap, that's going to affect the operation of that traction motor to which that air is going to. If the air is diminished, traction motor is going to run hotter, and I run a bigger chance of having a road failure. So that is really, really, really important. Worn or missing support brackets. Again, this is all bolted to the bottom. Some are bolted to the bottom, some are bolted on top. Depends on the application for that type of locomotive. And last but not least is accumulation of oil and or grease on the bellows. Remember, what does oil and grease do to rubber? It eats it. It chews away at it. Okay? So if I have an accumulation of oil or grease on that, that becomes a federal defect, because number one, it could be a fire hazard. Number two, we're eating away actually the actual rubber here in this component. Again, increasing the chance for a road failure. Okay? The next item, main reservoir tank telltale holes. Now, if you're on the railroad, or if you're just a railroad enthusiast, next time you get near one of these locomotives, take a look at the main reservoir tank, really, really close. You'll look and you'll see, unless it's aluminum or if it's the older style, you'll see these little bitty holes drilled in here, both radially, which is round, and longitudinally, which runs a full length. Every 12 inches, and you'll see that here in a second, there's a hole there. Let's find out what it's for. The purpose of the main reservoir telltale holes are to keep a visual or rust, dirt, or audible air leak indication that the tank has rusted through, thereby compromising the integrity of the tank. When rust is present in one of these holes or an air leak is heard, the tank, notice how it's bolded here? The tank must be removed from service. It, and again bolded, cannot be repaired and put back into service. Note, these telltale holes run the entire length of the main reservoir, both longitudinally as well as radially, approximately every 12 inches. So, you need to take a look at this tank, you know, when this thing's running, and listen and feel and look. If I got some rusty water coming out one of these telltale holes, that means that main reservoir tank has rusted through from the inside out, and that main reservoir now must be removed from service. You cannot repair it, you cannot fix it. The only thing you can do is remove it from service and install a new one. Okay? So defects are rust through, and number 2, air leaks. Okay? Really important. All right, let's see. Number 2, main reservoir check valve. That's this guy right here in front of this yellow arrow. Let's talk about it. The purpose of the number 2 main reservoir check valve is to prevent the loss of air from the tank in the event of a pipe fracture or a failure in the main reservoir circuit. Okay, this is main reservoir number 2. The air coming in through here, that's an 1.25 inch pipe, pretty good sized pipe. The air comes into here, takes that check valve, opens it up, and we fill that number 2 main reservoir up to 130 to 140 pounds of air for use with the air brake system. Remember, the number 2 main reservoir is used exclusively on most units for the air brake system. Now, in the event this pipe fractures, in the event I have my I lose my air compressor, whatever, this valve will slam shut and it will trap that air in this tank. Now, freight locomotives, equalizing reservoir and brake pipe are set at 90 psi with the automatic brake valve handle and release. That allows us to make 2 full service brake applications. We have 2 opportunities for that engineer to slow and stop our train before the air in this diminishes enough to the point where we can no longer get those 2 full service brake applications. Okay? So it's a safety device, it's a safety valve that allows the engineer the opportunity that if I have a problem or if I have a failure, that valve slams shut and I'm allowed to make 2 full brake applications before my air depletes. All right, so let's talk about this. Defects, loose or missing fasteners. You have those bolts if they get loose, absolutely. Have an air leak. Check valve installed backwards. That is huge. That check valve installed backwards, we're going to have a big problem trying to get air into that to begin with. Okay? So, just as information, when you have that check valve in your hand, you're going to remove it or install it. There's 2 landmarks you need to be aware of. Number 1 is the directional. It'll have an arrow. Okay? That arrow means it needs to go towards the tank because the air is flowing from that pipe into the tank. The next one, check valve installed upside down. Upside down? That's right. It's directionally sensitive into the up side. It'll actually say, it won't say up, it'll say TOP, top. So there's 2 landmarks you need to look for when installing this valve or you're inspecting that valve. Directional flow, which is the arrow, should be going towards the tank, and it should say top on the top up here. If top's at the bottom, that check valve is installed wrong. And the reason why the directional sensitive up side is so important, the actual check valve is actually where it's machined into the check valve body. It's actually not centered in that valve. It's actually oblong, or it's near the top. And what that does, it keeps that valve from getting caught up in the oil, the dirt, the water, any other debris in that tank, and it keeps that check valve away from that, so it won't impede the operation of that and then make that valve defective. So again, make sure the arrow's going in the right direction, and also make sure if it says up, or I mean top, not up. If it says top, make sure it's on the top. Okay. Check valve leaking air. Again, several reasons why it could be. You'd have debris under the seat. Again, there's also FRA rules, which we'll talk about down the road too, about checking these. They're very specific. Check valve spring leak or broken, verified by main reservoir leakage air test. Okay, so that's a very important component of that locomotive to stop or reduce, slow down or stop that train, is that valve right there. All right, let's move on. Well, it looks like we're here at the end. And again, here's our website. Go to it's www.fra.dot.gov. Once again, that's www.fra.dot.gov. I want to thank you for joining us again. Happy New Year. And 2015 is going to be a great year for all of us. So see you next week. Oh, by the way, one more thing. Be sure you go to lst-ca.com. lst-ca.com. Check us out. More things coming online soon. Thank you and have a safe day.